David Konstan, Professor of Classics, New York University, Xenophon, Subversive Socrates, or reading of Memorabilia 4.1-4.
Thank you very much, Don, for the kind introduction. And I will get right to the topic, although I confess in advance that I feel rather insecure. The title of my talk is bound to raise eyebrows, if not alarms. Xenophon's declared purpose in composing the Memorabilia was to defend Socrates against any charge of impiety or harming, corrupting, in the language of the indictment, anyone at all. As he puts it in the final chapter of his work, for my part, I have described him as he was, so pious as to do nothing without the judgment of the gods, so just as to do not the least harm to anyone, but rather to benefit all who associated with him in the greatest degree. He was supremely self-controlled, most sensible, and independent in his judgment, capable of speaking as well as in cross-examining others and urging them to excellence and nobility. And Xenophon sums him up by saying that Socrates seemed the very model of the best and happiest person. How could such a figure be remotely thought of as subversive? So let me state my position right away. That Socrates seemed to Xenophon, and that's, I think we have to understand emoi after that verb edoke in that penultimate sentence of the whole book, that he seemed to Xenophon to be the best of men doesn't necessarily imply that he would have been perceived that way by the majority of contemporary Athenians. The mistake, as I see it, lies in assuming that Xenophon's views were that of a typical citizen of Athens, or if not that precisely, that his intention was to exonerate Socrates of the charges of impiety and harming the youth by showing that he conformed in thought and action to what Athenians regarded as consummate piety and beneficence. But what if Xenophon's conception of these exemplary qualities was not that of the average Athenian, of the sort who sat in judgment over Socrates in the trial and condemned him to death? Suppose that what Xenophon meant by piety was quite different from what an average Athenian would have understood by the term. So much so, in fact, that someone who was pious by Xenophon's lights, or as he represented Socrates as being, might even look sacrilegious to the majority of his fellow citizens. Suppose, too, that what Xenophon chose to describe as beneficial might again seem quite otherwise when measured by popular views of advantage and of good and bad conduct. This is not a particularly challenging thought experiment. We do it readily enough when considering Plato's idealized image of Socrates, which was not necessarily such as to commend itself to the Athenian man in the street. And yet, for all the progress that has been made in recent decades in our understanding of Xenophon's views, which are in many respects very much his own, we still, I think, find it hard to shake off the conception of him as a man of mediocre intelligence who might have dumbed down Socrates to the extent that he understood what he had to say, but certainly was incapable of creating a picture of him that was coherent and informed by an original vision, however much or little this corresponded to the real Socrates. So to put it schematically, we may identify three images of Socrates. At one extreme, there is the ostensibly real man, whose views we must reconstruct hazardously from the testimonies of his disciples. At the other, there is the Socrates whom the Athenians, or at least the majority of the jurors, convicted and saw as worthy of the death penalty for his impiety and corrosive influence on the young, although a great many others voted to acquit him, and so doubtless saw him differently. Between these extremes, there's the Socrates we see in the pages of Xenophon or of Plato. On the most common view, Xenophon's purpose in recording his memoirs of Socrates is to show that those who condemned him got him wrong. If they had seen Socrates as Xenophon represented him, they would have appreciated his virtues and honored him as the best of citizens. I wish to suggest that this was not Xenophon's intention. Rather, he offers a portrait of Socrates, or a Socrates, who by Xenophon's own standards is all those good things. But Xenophon's ideas of piety and beneficence are not those of the general public, any more than Socrates' own views were. To put it starkly, an average Athenian, upon reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, might as easily have concluded that the jurors were right in convicting Socrates as that they were terribly misguided. That is what I mean by saying that Xenophon's Socrates was subversive of ordinary Athenian values. Okay, now for the proof. But first, let me express my gratitude to the faithful members of the Xenophon Reading Group, which has met almost weekly over the past half year and more, and read together in minute detail the fourth book of the Memorabilia. These are Gabriel Danzig, Jamie Redfield, Dave Johnson, Chloe Bala, and Olga Chernyavskaya. I am indebted too to the many others who participated in the series of talks sponsored by the research group that Don mentioned, Triangulating Socrates, and hosted by the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Now, none of them is responsible for the views I am about to present, of course, though you may conclude, perhaps rightly, that they should have been better disciplinarians. So, part two now, which I'm calling the Elenkos. The fourth book of the Memorabilia begins, but neither did Socrates hide his view concerning what is just. This follows on the preceding discussion of piety. Now, this is not necessarily the most promising defense of Socrates' character if it carries the suggestion that Socrates had a conception of his own about the just, which may not have accorded entirely with what others suppose. It is just this kind of wedge that I propose to insert between Xenophon Socrates and what we might, with Kenneth Dover, call popular morality. Xenophon goes on to explain that when Socrates spoke of being in love, it wasn't the physical attraction of boys that aroused him, but the souls of those who were naturally drawn to arete. He recognized these by the fact that they were quick learners, had good memories, and were passionate to learn everything that was useful for managing both the home and the city. Now, Matthew Christ has recently argued forcefully that the target audience for Xenophon's works in general, not just the Socratic writings, was the Athenian elite, with a view to motivating them to re-enter politics, not so as to overthrow the democracy, but to guide and improve it. Broadly speaking, this may well be right. I find the argument very cogent. But the group that Socrates picks out here in this passage is not the traditional aristocracy, who, for all I know, were as dim as the conventional image of the British landed nobility, but rather those most gifted intellectually. Now, there may have been some distinction in Xenophon's own mind between them. Some among this class, Xenophon tells us, believed that they were naturally good, and to these he explained that those natures that are thought to be, or perhaps regard themselves as best, are most in need of paideia. In the same way, the most spirited in horses and dogs are most in need of being broken in early. Socrates further qualifies this type as naturally outstanding, fittest in soul, and best able to accomplish whatever they set their hands to. In addition to these people of natural talent, Socrates has also to deal with the wealthy, who, on this account, their wealth, are arrogant and confident that they are not in need of education. Socrates is particularly harsh on these types, asserting that anyone who thinks he can distinguish the harmful from the useful without learning is a moron, moros, and a fool if he thinks that money without knowledge will bring him esteem. Now, still a third type that Socrates has to win over consists of those who think they already know it all, like the adolescent Euthydemus, who prides himself on his wisdom because he has read all the poets and sophists. Xenophon proceeds to show how Socrates humbled the youth, first arousing his interest by staging some conversations near the leather shop where the boy hung out, and then by a series of cross-examinations that cast the poor kid into despondency. So now I'm going to look at this Elenchus part first. Socrates first raises the question of whether Themistocles achieved his abilities by associating with some wise person or was simply gifted by nature. And he avows that it would be simple-minded to suppose that ordinary skills require teachers, but governing a city comes spontaneously. This piques Euthydemus's interest, though it doesn't quite speak to his case, since he believed he could acquire the necessary skills from reading, not simply on his own. Then, when Socrates saw Euthydemus hovering at a distance as Socrates discoursed, and Euthydemus didn't want to seem too admiring, Socrates pointed to him directly and announced to the company that the boy thinks that the best advertisement for his abilities when it comes to advising the city will be the appearance of not having learned anything from anyone. Socrates mocks Euthydemus by ventriloquizing a similar declaration concerning medicine. A person who says, I'm an expert in medicine, but I never learned from anyone, which sounds absurd. When Euthydemus continues to maintain silence as a way of projecting an image of Sophrosyne, Socrates adds that even flute and cithara players, and horseback riders too, affirm their credentials by reference to their teachers. Yet those who propose to lead the city imagine that they can do it spontaneously and of a sudden, without preparation or practice. Having now caught the boy's attention, Socrates comes to him alone at the leather shop, and I'm inclined to think this is the shop of Simon the shoemaker, but that's a separate question entirely, and asks him whether he has really collected so great a quantity of writings by men who are said to be wise. Now, we oughtn't to let the casual switch back to the authority of written texts go unremarked. Perhaps it makes sense to doubt that one can learn to play a musical instrument from books alone, and so too for writing, even if Xenophon himself composed an essay on the subject. This might not be true, however, of geometry. Does it obtain for politics to the extent that this can be learned? Well, Socrates proceeds to flatter Euthydemus for preferring wisdom to wealth, and then asks him in what area he wishes to excel, thanks to his reading, suggesting in turn medicine, which is rich in written texts, architecture, geometry, astronomy, and poetic recitation. It's interesting that these are areas that you would learn something from texts. He finally alights on politics, by which people are able to rule and be useful to themselves and others, to which Euthydemus assents as the excellence he most desires. When Socrates further asks whether one can be good at this art without being just, Euthydemus agrees that justice is indispensable. And what's more, he affirms that he has shown himself inferior to no one in being just. So Socrates, as we might expect, then inquires whether those who are just can describe their deeds of justice, the way carpenters can point to their achievements. When Euthydemus affirms that he can, and also those of injustice, Socrates proposes that they make two lists, one labeled delta for deeds of dikaiosune, and the other alpha for deeds of adikia. Euthydemus confidently places lying, deception, wrongdoing, or fraud, and enslavement of others under alpha, adikia. But Socrates shows that there are situations in which each of these behaviors is justified. For example, enslaving the people of a hostile city would hardly be deemed unjust, as Euthydemus agrees, nor is stealing and plundering their goods. So to this, Euthydemus stipulates the proviso that such acts are unjust when committed against philoi. Well, Socrates then demonstrates that lying to friends and allies may also be the right thing to do, as when a general tells his dispirited troops that help is on the way, so as to rouse their courage. So too, deceiving a child into taking his medicine, or filching the sword of a friend who is in despair so he won't hurt himself, are just actions. Now here we're readily reminded of Socrates' argument in the first book of Plato's Republic, where he shows that one oughtn't to return a sword to a man who has in the meantime lost his wits. This may confirm the Socratic origin of that example, it's hard to know. The next step for Euthydemus might well have been to distinguish just and unjust acts on the basis of intention. Willingly to harm a friend goes under alpha, adikia. But Socrates forestalls that move by asking whether it is more unjust to harm a friend voluntarily or involuntarily. Euthydemus by now no longer trusts his replies, but he ventures to say that doing so voluntarily is less just. Well, Socrates again trips him up by suggesting that being just is a matter of learning and knowledge, just as grammar is. Now, one who knows his letters can certainly write and read incorrectly, but will do so consciously and is capable of doing both correctly, whereas one who makes mistakes involuntarily is illiterate. So the person who knows grammar can make mistakes deliberately, but he's the one who's more knowledgeable. So too, a person who knows what is just is both more just than one who is ignorant and also more capable of doing something unjust if he should wish to do so. And what is more, he alone can do it intentionally. So Euthydemus is thoroughly perplexed by now, and no wonder. One begins to wonder whether an Alcibiades or a Critias, having acquired a knowledge of justice from Socrates, might still not be counted among the more just of men, despite all the crimes they later commit. Because after all, if they really have learned from Socrates to make the proper distinctions, then even though they do commit crimes, they're the ones who do so voluntarily, and the ones who do so voluntarily are the more just. Here's where you see where I'm leading. This elenchus is a dangerous procedure. I'm not the first to notice that. With a characteristic leap, Socrates now inquires whether a person who wishes to tell the truth but keeps changing his mind from one moment to the next can be said to know what he thinks he knows. And Euthydemus says, certainly not. Socrates then equates a lack of knowledge with slavishness, though he is quick to point out that it's not ignorance of a coppersmith's art or of carpentry or leatherworking, since most of those who practice those crafts, as Euthydemus says, are themselves slavish. Rather a tactless remark, given that he's availing himself of the hospitality of a leatherworker at this very moment. The term applies rather to those ignorant of what is fine, good, and just. Now, the barb strikes home. Euthydemus had prided himself on possessing just this kind of knowledge, as he practiced what he regarded as philosophy. But for all his efforts, he cannot provide answers concerning the matters he ought most to know. Socrates has yet another trick up his sleeve, but let's pause to consider the effect of this interrogation to this point, not on Euthydemus, who is clearly driven to despair, but on the reader. If Xenophon intended to portray Socrates as a purveyor of conventional wisdom or simply as harmless, he would seem to have gone about it in the worst possible way. For his Socrates displays that critical, corrosive intelligence that must have disturbed a good many Athenians, whatever their social position. Euthydemus thought he could acquire wisdom by reading the poets and the sages, the traditional storehouse of moral instruction, only to find that such lore cannot stand up to the Socratic elenchus. If Socrates is the model of a live teacher, such as he insists is necessary for proper learning, what he has to offer leads to radical doubt about the very nature of what is just, and hence the basis of sound citizenship. Perhaps he will yet come up with some positive doctrine that will rescue poor Euthydemus from his aporia. I should point out here that this is the most extensive elenchus recorded in the Memorabilia, but it comes at a crucial point at the consummation of the entire work, and I think deserves to be taken seriously for the image of Socrates that it presents. Now, Socrates next makes another of his sudden shifts of focus, and he asks Euthydemus whether he has ever been to Delphi and read the famous inscription on the temple of Apollo there, namely, know thyself. It seems that this is an instance of writing that Euthydemus has not considered seriously, since he had supposed that he knew himself as well as he knew anything. Socrates once again narrows down the kind of knowledge in question to that of one's capacity, just as someone perching a horse, dunamis is the word, would wish to know its character. Those who know their own abilities fare best, since they understand what they can and cannot do. They steer clear of what they do not know, and so are unerring, anamartetoi. As a result, they are esteemed and honored, which is what Euthydemus, of course, aspires to, whereas those who do not have such knowledge fail in their enterprises, are punished for their mistakes, and are ridiculous and despised in the eyes of all, just as cities are, which overestimate their power. Now, Euthydemus is persuaded and appeals to Socrates for instruction on where to begin the process of knowing himself. Socrates then asks the lad whether he knows the difference between good things and bad, to which Euthydemus confidently replies that he does, for not to know this would make him worse than any slave. And you have to, the play on slavery runs throughout this section. We've already handled just and unjust, now it's good and bad. He offers health as an example of good and sickness as bad, along with whatever contributes to each condition, such as foods and activities. Socrates points out, however, that a healthy person may well undertake actions that lead to harm, which he would have avoided if he had been ill. The illustration given is rather trivial. A person who, because of poor health, does not embark on a ship that is destined to sink will fare better than the stronger person who did go on the ship. So the consequences of health are uncertain, and this makes health itself no more good than sickness, at least in absolute terms. So Euthydemus next offers wisdom or skill, Sophia, as surely an unequivocally good thing. And again, Socrates demonstrates that Sophia, or at least a reputation for cleverness, can lead to harm, citing Daedalus and Palamedes as instances, the one having been enslaved by Minos, the other murdered by Odysseus for his ingenuity. Now, this may seem like very slippery reasoning. Intelligence in itself is a good thing, we may be inclined to suppose, even if a brilliant atomic scientist runs a greater risk than you or I of being kidnapped by a foreign power. That's really the kind of example given. Perhaps a Stoic might have replied that so long as he retained his virtue, such a fate is in itself indifferent. But Socrates is directing his arguments at an adolescent who evidently takes it for granted that bodily well-being and personal freedom are important values. Euthydemus has one more candidate for an undisputed good, and this one would seem to be unimpeachable, ta eudaimonen. But Socrates is again ready with a counter-argument. Eudaimonia would be good if it weren't made up of equivocal goods, such as beauty, strength, wealth, reputation, and so forth, all of which Euthydemus counts among the constituents of happiness. But these attributes, like health and cleverness, have been the cause of harm to many. So even eudaimonia fails as a good haplos. Now, once again, we might try to come to Euthydemus's aid by proposing a sense of happiness that is independent of these worldly advantages, and perhaps a complete course under the tutelage of Socrates would reveal what that is. However that may be, Socrates has certainly undermined any trust in conventional notions of well-being, and I expect that an average Athenian reader, even one belonging to the aristocratic elite, might find Socrates' line of inquiry unsettling rather than proof of his incontrovertible utility to society. When Euthydemus, now wholly befuddled, exclaims that he no longer knows what to beseech the gods for, and it's worth noting this formulation, as we shall see, Socrates ascribes his confusion to overconfidence. And then, since the boy aspires to be a political leader, he asks whether he knows what democracy is. Well, since understanding democracy implies knowing what the demos means, Socrates says, Euthydemus replies that the demos consists of the poor citizens, a standard use of the term. And who are the poor, asks Socrates, and who are the rich? To which Euthydemus replies that those who have not the resources to accomplish what is needed are poor, and those who have an abundance of such resources are rich. Socrates' response to this definition is predictable. Many who possess little find it to be more than enough, whereas for some, such as tyrants, no amount suffices. Thus, tyrants must be included in the demos, and those who have little if they are economical among the rich. At this point, Euthydemus concludes that it's best to him to keep quiet, since he clearly knows nothing at all. Whereas earlier his reticence was opposed to protect his image, here it is a genuine acknowledgement of ignorance. Xenophon concludes by observing that the boy departed in utter despair, despising himself and believing he was truly a slave. However, whereas many, after such a humiliating dialogue, abandoned the company of Socrates, Euthydemus cleaved to him thereafter and even imitated him in some respects. In view of this, Socrates, Xenophon tells us, ceased to perturb the boy and proceeded to explain to him in the simplest and clearest way what he thought one should know and the best way to behave. And so now I come to the second part of this discussion, which I call the disquisition. Xenophon appears to be marking a distinction between two phases of the Socratic method. Check it, everybody see here. Yep. The first is critical and proceeds by way of cross-examination or elenchus to undermine his interlocutor's confidence in his values and convictions. This is the part that presumably made Athenians uncomfortable since their deeply held beliefs were challenged. The second stage takes the form of an extended exposition of Socrates' own position, the kind of great speech that Socrates insists he cannot abide in Plato's Protagoras. Perhaps defensively there, as Sarah Brody and Barbara Sattler have suggested in this very colloquium. If Socrates, contrary to his professions of ignorance, is prepared to enunciate a positive doctrine, it may be thought to compensate for the caustic effect of the elenchus, which is now seen as purely a preliminary or propedeutic strategy to render his interlocutor receptive. That this approach, if indeed it is Xenophon's way of exonerating Socrates from the charge of corrupting youths, comes at the expense of Socratic irony, it's a price worth paying. So let's see what Socrates actually has to offer in this regard. And so just to sum up till now, the elenchus is corrosive. The elenchus has left this boy without any confidence that he knows what is just and unjust. How will Socrates rescue him? And we might expect that in delivering his positive doctrine right now, that would be Xenophon's way of showing that Socrates, in fact, helped people, made them just, made them virtuous, and was a benefit to the city. So Xenophon's first move is to affirm that Socrates had no interest in making his associates more eloquent, effective, or astute, but sought above all to render them sophron, which alone could ensure that they would not be more able to behave unjustly thanks to these talents. Now, the precise meaning of sophrosine in Xenophon has been the subject of considerable discussion, but here Xenophon specifies immediately that Socrates' primary objective was to make people sophrones with respect to the gods. So we can limit our investigation here to that context. Xenophon affirms that he himself was present at the following conversation, a way of highlighting its importance, whatever the truth of the matter. Socrates begins by asking Euthydemus whether he's ever noticed how much care the gods take to provide whatever human beings need, to which Euthydemus replies that he has not noticed this. Now, this should alert the reader to the fact that Socrates is venturing on unfamiliar territory. There is no reason to doubt that Euthydemus was pious enough as ordinary conceptions went. This evidently did not entail the belief that the gods were essentially beneficent. And given the way the gods were commonly portrayed, that's no wonder. So Socrates' demonstration in what follows cannot be taken to exemplify his piety in the typical sense, and may even risk suggesting that conventional attitudes toward the gods were faulty if they did not rest on such a conviction about their beneficence. Socrates' arguments are at first blush rather elementary, but they exhibit a rising rhetorical crescendo. The gods have given us the alternation between daylight, by which we can see, and night, so we may rest. Euthydemus agrees that this is worthy of gratitude. So too, the sun marks the hours of the day, and the stars those of the night during which they are visible, whereas the moon marks the division of the month. The gods are also responsible for the fertility of the earth in providing nourishment and more, as well as water and fire, which again, Euthydemus agrees, are signs of their philanthropia and their concern. So too, the sun in its course provides just the right amount of heat and cold, all for the sake of human beings. Very well, says Euthydemus, but the gods provide the same for other creatures. How are human beings special? Socrates replies that it is precisely human beings who derive the most benefit from other animals, and for whose sake these other animals are raised. Indeed, animals are more valuable than plants, since humans can survive on animals and animal products alone, not to mention that animals are also of use in war. Then again, the gods have bestowed on us the five senses, along with reason, by which we understand and perceive each thing and remember what is good. And they've also given us language or communication, by which we share goods and live in common and establish laws in civic life. And to top it off, they've provided for what we cannot foresee by means of prophecy, by which they answer our questions concerning the future. All of this, again, you can imagine is familiar, but it's a curious argument to which Euthydemus is not privy previously. Euthydemus shrewdly remarks that the gods are friendlier to Socrates than to the rest of people, since they signal to him unbidden what he ought and ought not to do. Socrates ignores this allusion to his daimonion and simply adds that Euthydemus can confirm the truth of what he has been saying if he does not expect to see the visible shapes of the god, but is content to worship and honor them on the basis of their deeds, which he can see. This is a theme in Xenophon more generally, that you know a person's inner mind by the actions that he performs. For the gods in general do not manifest themselves when they bestow their favors. And what is more, that deity who arranges and binds together the entire cosmos, in which all fine and good things are located, and who unerringly delivers them fresh and sound and ageless, his activity is perceived, but he manages it all unseen. So too, one cannot stare directly at the sun, nor can we observe the coming and departure of the thunderbolt. The winds are unseen, though what they do is apparent to us. And finally, the soul, which more than any other human quality partakes of divinity, rules us, but is unperceived. So we must recognize the power of invisible things and pay honor to the divine, to daimonion. Now, Euthydemus is wholly persuaded and vows that he will never neglect the daimonion, but he is in despair again over how a human being could ever compensate the services of the gods with the gratitude that they deserve. Before we turn to Socrates' reply, we may first ask, where did Xenophon get this extraordinary theodicy, and what is its place in his defense of Socrates? As to Xenophon's source, Aldo Brancacci has identified two possibilities, and I quote an article of his from Elencos, the journal. He writes, the peculiar character of these theological conceptions and their very compactness admit, in my view, of just two hypotheses. Either they derive from Socrates, whatever the source utilized by Xenophon, or else they derive from Antisthenes. But Brancacci concludes, in part on the basis of explicit references to this chapter by Philodemus and Cicero, that the doctrines that Xenophon's Socrates espouses are incompatible with Antisthenes' views. And so, I quote him again, it is thus the more likely that in the theological chapters of the Memorabilia, one should discern traces of the beliefs that Socrates developed toward the end of the first phase of his philosophical activity, or at least the terms in which they were formulated in the sources on which Xenophon depended. What these sources were, it is impossible to determine, and the only advantage, but the relevant one, of having excluded the hypothesis of Antisthenes as a source consists in reinforcing the possibility that they were recollections or transcriptions, no doubt reworked by Xenophon, of conversations actually held by Socrates. So this is a fair representation of Socrates' views. Now, if so, if this is true, what Brancacci says, then Xenophon was not attempting to soft pedal Socrates' theology, but simply attempting to reproduce it, to the best of his ability, without concern for the way it might be received by his readers. The reception of Xenophon's theodicy also suggests that we are dealing with an authentic Socratic position, at least in outline. David Sedley has remarked, in general, Socrates' teleological influence on Aristotle, such as it is mediated through Plato. However, Memorabilia 1.4, there's another theodicy there, and 4.3, our chapter, include ideas which seem to have had a direct impact upon Aristotle's thinking without any corresponding passage in Plato to mediate them. This was Sedley's view, and I continue with Sedley. One of them is Socrates' thesis, the one we just looked at, that lower species were created for the sake of mankind. And Sedley notes that these two passages have been rarely discussed. But the passage we have been examining did, I think, make an impression on Plato, evident in particular in Plato's critique of atheism in the Laws. The Athenian visitor argues that the good soul causes the perimeter of heaven to revolve of necessity, taking care and putting it in order, kosmouson. He adduces the analogy of the sun, whose body everyone sees, though no one sees its soul. Again, I recall that Xenophon mentioned that we can't look directly at the sun, but in that sense, its source of its power is hidden from us, but we feel it. And which is the case for all creatures, living or dead. So much for those who deny the very existence of the gods in Plato. But, the Athenian continues, now we must encourage the man who believes that gods exist, but they are not concerned with human affairs. He asks Cleinias to assume the part of the young man in the discussion, which perhaps recalls the role of Euthydemus in the Memorabilia. And he proceeds to show, and again I quote the passage in the Laws, that the gods care for small things no less than for those that are exceedingly large. And the Athenian concludes, let us persuade the young man by our arguments that all things are ordered by one who cares for everything with a view to the preservation and excellence of the whole, and that of these things, each part too, to the best of its abilities, suffers and does what it is and what is proper to it. Now, there are many details in Plato's treatment that have no counterpart in Xenophon, especially the business about two types of soul, good and evil, and the emphasis on the virtues of the gods. But the overall progression from the proof of the gods' existence to their management and concern for every aspect of the world, together with the culminating affirmation of a single deity who is responsible for ordering the entire thing, the whole business, strikes me as a plain echo of Xenophon's Socrates. You have picked one person that orders the cosmos, and that's the God that renders everything deliberately and consciously favorable to human beings. There are echoes in the language, especially in the language of concern, that strike me as strong indications that Plato has Xenophon in mind here. Most of the studies of Xenophon and Plato's relationship these days tend to see Xenophon as the one who borrowed from Plato. But if a passage in the Laws seems similar to something in Xenophon, then the influence has to go the other way. Now, it's impossible to sort out precisely what in Xenophon's account may reproduce Socrates' own words. My point is simply that Xenophon has earnestly attempted to convey Socrates' reasoning as he overheard and recollected it, and that his defense of Socrates' piety is not tailored to popular conceptions, but reflects a style of argument that, for all its high-mindedness, may not have assuaged suspicions that Socrates was indeed introducing new gods, namely that God that runs the cosmos and so on, the same kind of God that Plato talks about. So if we had been expecting that in the straightforward description, the disquisition, as I've been calling it, as opposed to the elenchus, we would see something of Socrates' utility and piety as conceived by the ordinary Athenian. This doesn't turn out to be the case. So we may return now to Euthydemus's worry about showing sufficient gratitude for the gods' beneficence. Socrates encourages him not to despair, since, and by the way, athumia is a pervasive term for this despair, despondency, and so on in this section, since the Delphic oracle consistently advises that one propitiate the gods in accord with the customs of one's own city, and that it suffices to conciliate the gods according to one's ability without falling short of that. For the gods are most able to benefit us, and there is no better way to please them than by obeying them. It was by saying such things, Xenophon concludes, and acting accordingly himself, that Socrates rendered those who associated with him more pious and well-behaved. Now I have a final, not very long section, about a quarter of what I've done so far, that I think I will summarize for a bit, just in the interest of time and to leave as much time possible for discussion. What comes next is Socrates' demonstration that to be just is the same equivalent to being a respect for the laws. That, in other words, to be dikaios is to be nomimos. And this part of the conversation he engages in with Hippias. Hippias complains that Socrates is very good at cross-examining others and exposing their weaknesses, but he's never reveals his own views. And that is what Socrates at a certain point changes around and tries to get clear. Now, let me just make it clear that Socrates wraps up his demonstration with the announcement, I have demonstrated that the lawful and the just are the same thing. To nomimon and the dikaion are to auton. They are the same thing. And Hippias agrees. Now, this is all very well, but what happens when what are the circumstances in which you would do right and wrong? And Socrates very abruptly asks Hippias at this point, do you know of any unwritten laws? And this is a passage many of you may be familiar with. And Socrates argues along the lines that Aristotle will later repeat in the rhetoric almost exactly, that there are unwritten laws that are universal among mankind because, and we know this because people share these laws, even though they have very different languages and live in distant places, so they cannot have acquired them by communication and mutual influence. Xenophon makes a further step that Aristotle doesn't in that context, which is that these laws must then be laws by the unwritten laws that are given to us by the gods. They're not just universal, but they are more particularly given to us not by any given legislator, but by the gods. Well, here you recognize an analogy with Antigone's posture in the play by Sophocles named for her, but there's an important difference. Antigone never stated that all laws must be obeyed. Had she done so, she would have been in a quandary, because why then is Creon's edict not a law that must be obeyed? Socrates has claimed that all laws must be obeyed because respecting the law is the same as being just. And now we have a situation of divine laws. How do you know which it is? I'll quote here Tazuko van Berkel's observation in her recent book, The Economics of Friendship. And she says, it's striking that in this passage, Xenophon's Socrates nowhere acknowledges attention between a position that accords supreme validity to the legislation of the polis and a position that presupposes the existence of laws of a higher legislative status. Nowhere in the dialogue do the conversation partners address the potential for conflict between the positive law of the city and the unwritten laws. Socrates simply seems to be in favor of both. And many scholars, including Don Morrison, Dave Johnson, and Gabriel Danzig, have provided various ways of answering this problem. On the surface, the general injunctions to revere the gods, honor one's parents, avoid incest, and show gratitude to benefactors seem unlikely to run afoul of practical legislation. The danger arises when such principles when an appeal to such principles underwrites certain specific actions, for example, honoring your kin when they have betrayed their city, as Polynices had done in the Antigone. It is for this reason, among others, that as Tasuko van Berkel writes, and I quote her again, in the post-403 constitution, nomos came to refer by definition to written law in Athens. The Athenians had adopted a resolution that banned the use of unwritten laws to ensure that magistrates could only enforce laws that had been inscribed. By this time, she continues, the notion of unwritten divine law had probably become suspect due to anti-democratic parties who attempted to invoke the notion in order to overrule the written democratic law of Athens. Xenophon, writing in the 4th century, was no doubt aware of this issue, even if the dramatic date of the dialogues that he records was earlier. So, really now coming very much to the end, if we consider Socrates' position on unwritten laws within the context of the Memorabilia, it may appear that he was providing a theoretical basis for acting contrary to the wishes of the assembled demos, or of the ruling 30, or the sworn and seated dicasts. In the jury, he insisted in each case, and he has insisted right in this passage, that he was refusing to act contrary to the law. But nowhere did he specify which laws were at stake. So he's defended himself, as he defends himself in Plato's Apology, for refusing to obey the 30, refusing to allow the demos when assembled to illegitimately prosecute the generals who were responsible for the disaster at Arginusi. And of course, he did not present himself in the way that was customary in making his defense. So the description of Socrates' behavior and the conversation about divinely sanctioned laws are bookends to the argument that obedience to the law is the same as justice. Now, I would go further, in fact, and suggest that the primacy given to unwritten law may look back to Socrates' mockery of Euthydemus's book learning at the beginning of Book 4. And not just that, Socrates began by demonstrating that Euthydemus, for all his political ambitions, was unable to identify anything that was unequivocally good. The solution to his dilemma came not in the form of a better answer, though we could imagine some, nor a radical skepticism about any such absolute, but rather in the form of a disquisition on the indisputable beneficence of the gods, a position very likely that of Socrates himself, however much altered in transmission. This speech paves the way, I think, for Socrates' later argument that the gods have planted in us certain values recognizable by their universality and guaranteed them by rendering them self-enforcing. What is more, every city has its own laws concerning how to propitiate the gods, and all prescribe that we honor them, an anticipation of the universal rule to revere the gods, even if specific forms of worship may vary from place to place. Identifying conduct that may violate divine injunctions in any given case presumably takes some experience as well as dedicated reflection on such matters, although Socrates himself is blessed with a kind of shortcut in the form of his daimonion. Taken in its entirety, Xenophon's representation of Socrates in this chapter may well have roused rather than allayed suspicions concerning his piety and service to the city. In being true to Socrates as he remembered him, Xenophon has given a portrait not of an upright citizen of conventional integrity, but rather of the potentially subversive figure that Socrates seemed to be and actually was. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll applaud on behalf of all the muted people. And now we'll move on to the discussion period moderated by me. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, please click the raise your hand button. We use that bit of the technology. If you have trouble with raise your hand function, send a private chat to me. We're a large number. Please keep your questions concise and limit yourself to one per intervention so that other people have a chance to ask their questions. Nick Smith.
Yeah, hi, thanks. What I wanted to just sort of note was that there are really two pieces to your argument. And I think they're fully detachable. So it seems to me that you're right, that Xenophon doesn't simply try to dress up the historical Socrates as some sort of garden variety Joe Average. That seems right. It seems like he was very likely to be presenting the historical Socrates, but in ways that he wanted to sort of present to his readers as sort of not guilty of the charges and such. So with respect to what he was actually doing, I think that part of your argument seems right. The part about the garden variety Athenian deciding actually on reading this that Socrates was actually guilty. I just wanted to note that this is a really interesting, in a way, echo of debates that were had about the Platonic Socrates and Vlastos's assertion that the Platonic Socrates is depicted as having such radically unusual religious beliefs that the Athenians would likely find him guilty. And so I just noticed that the same argument is coming up here. And by the way, also the same argument coming up here as was had 15, 20 years ago about the so-called apology credo problem with respect to obedience to law. So it's just funny how history repeats itself. But I just wanted to say that with respect to both of those issues, it seems like the same sorts of replies as were made to Vlastos and the same sorts of replies as were made to those who said that Socrates was perfectly glad willy-nilly to disobey authentic legal authority seem to me to apply to the Xenophon case. But I'll just recommend that literature as sort of making the relevant case mutatis mutandis.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. And of course, I think you're right. I did allude to the Platonic Socrates and the problems that he raises. And I think it was Vlastos who first pointed to the apology credo tension in an early article. I think he was the first to raise that, to have a specific article on that one, whereas, he's, is he going to obey the laws or is he not going to obey them, as he didn't do when the 30, for example, ordered him to perform a certain action and he refused. That is, I think, how can I put it? I think I saw my purpose here as showing that the same level of difficulty pertains to understanding Xenophon's representation of Socrates as does with Plato's. I don't think the Vlastos position has so much been answered as it's been shown to be an ongoing source of difficulty in accommodating just what kinds of views Socrates may have held. When you get to Xenophon, however, it seems to me you don't have to look far afield in taking the apology and then the Crito in order to bring them together and hints in one and hints in the other. Xenophon's strong statement that Socrates always simply regarded respect for the law as what is just. I mean, very powerfully, very direct, without any equivocation. And then moving on in this very same passage to show that Socrates was perfectly content to do things that seemed to violate at least decrees without making a distinction between what's a nomos and what's a kerugma and so on. And then further, invoking unwritten laws, which would at least suggest the possibility of a tension between the one and the other, and the possibility that he was following unwritten laws when he did perform the actions that he did. And yet, without resolving that kind of tension, here, the difficulties that are raised by Plato, you have two ways of looking at it. Either you can say Xenophon is insouciant and conscious, he doesn't really realize the things that he's raising, or he's giving us a Socrates that is every bit as problematic as the most doubtful people find him in Plato. And I'm inclined to think it's the latter. I don't think Xenophon was fooling himself or unaware of what kind of impression people who thought through this section of this memorabilia would make. So there's a kind of very general answer to the question. But at the very least, I'd like to bring Xenophon in for the same degree of scrutiny.
William Altman.
Well, David, I do have a question, but first I'd like to praise your wondrous paper, especially its thesis of the bifurcate audience, and to offer some support for it. You cited 4.2 generally as the subversive angle, and you also mentioned 4.2.40, where Euthydemus, unlike the others that Socrates regarded as blekoteroi, stuck around. And then, of course, you also cited 4.3.2, where Xenophon says that I was present at a dialogue with Euthydemus. As you're aware, I'm not the only one that thinks that Euthydemus is Xenophon. In other words, that goes back to Delabec, Dacanes. There are hints of it in Dorion, and I think that if you're willing to go that way against Uncle Leo, who of course thinks that Euthydemus is a blockhead, but if you're willing to make the Xenophon Euthydemus connection, it offers very clear support for your thesis, because Euthydemus, as Xenophon, clearly thinks that there's great value to what Socrates did, whereas the blekoteroi did not. So it kind of gives you a bifurcate thing. Now, my question, David, is this. Is think about a 19th century German response to your paper. It was a truism of 19th century German philology on the memorabilia that the Schutzschrift, the defense against impiety, against Polycrates, was the earliest, the memorabilia, and that everything else is later. And so what a German philologist might have said was, well, Xenophon at first is doing this apologetic thing, but then in these later books, he's doing what Konstan is saying. What I'd like you to do is push back against that, especially because I'm very influenced by Hans von Arnim, who in 1923 argued that the Schutzschrift was originally it was the earliest part of the memorabilia, but was integrated with book 4 as well, particularly the conversations with Euthydemus, particularly 4.2. In other words, that we had these two poles that you've pointed out as being consistent with each other in the same text. And so I just wondered if you would push back strongly in favor of the unity of a memorabilia that puts the Schutzschrift together with 4.2 and the dialogues with Euthydemus.
This is a good one. Well, that Polycrates did not write an apology, I think we have to realize is clear. And so any influence that he might have had on Xenophon's apology wouldn't be plausible. Xenophon's writing a very different kind of document. Now, what the order was of Xenophon's apology and Xenophon's memorabilia could be brought into question. It had never really occurred to me to think that way until I read Dave Johnson on the subject. And he makes a very good case for keeping an open mind on whether the apology or the memorabilia would have come first. And in any case, he argues that this may not matter. What we really do need to know is that they're addressed to different kinds of audiences. So the apology is addressed to an audience that finds it already incredible that Socrates should have lost the case. And so we need an explanation for why he would have made such a poor rhetorical defense. Whereas the memorabilia is addressed to people who are not at all sure that Socrates was pious and helpful to beneficial to others rather than corrupting, and so you need to be convinced of this. Now, one might, and this seems to me very plausible, that understood by their addressees, narratee, you might say, they're the difference between the two arguments is there. For the possibility that Euthydemus represents a young Socrates, well, yes, he might. I mean, it's young Xenophon. He might well. Xenophon includes within the memorabilia, after all, the section in which he himself needs to learn from Socrates, and in fact ends up being more stubborn than the reverse about whether one should be indifferent to attraction to young men. So there's good reason, at least if not to say that a conversation such as that necessarily occurred with Xenophon when he was young, but then it might have, and he just puts Euthydemus in instead of himself, a plausible strategy. It's perfectly reasonable. As he says, he overheard it, and if he overheard it, he certainly overheard it when he himself was young. So it's the kind of thing that he could easily identify with. And I'd be willing to, yes, agree with you on that one.
Okay, David Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for a lovely talk. As you know already, I mean, I'm largely in agreement with you on this stuff. I wanted to give you a chance. I wanted to give you a chance to say a little bit more about what you think Xenophon is doing rather than what he's not doing, right? So he's not offering a conventional defense of Socrates. You referred to Christ, right? Whose important new book on Xenophon democracy, I think is really on to something, but it's not clear to me that, say, the Elenchus passage with Euthydemus is Euthydemus wants to be a leader, right? And so that's in fitting with what Chris says, right? Chris's thesis that Xenophon is trying to encourage elites to become leaders. But the Elenchus itself, that passage itself, doesn't offer a whole lot of encouragement to take on a leadership position, nor at least in any obvious sense do 4.3 or 4.4. So I guess I'm wondering what you think, if you give you a chance to say a little bit more about what you think Xenophon is doing, if he's not, as was sort of conventionally assumed, defending Xenophon before a democratically inspired attack.
Well, he presumably, it's a good question, and I didn't formulate it in those terms to myself, so it's very good to have me think about it now. He is presumably writing these reminiscences not only to remind himself, as someone might well do, of his experience with Socrates, which evidently had a very powerful influence on him, but with some readership in mind. And as you yourself suggest, it's going to be readership that has some doubts about Socrates' virtue and therefore needs to be persuaded. And I think that must be correct. Now, who are they? Are these, they're going to be literate people, presumably. This may include a larger percentage of the Athenian public than we customarily suppose. I don't go along with William Harris's view that about 5% of the Athenians were functionally literate. This seems to me an impossibly small number, given many other reasons for thinking so. So a fairly wide audience is plausible. When Socrates says in the Apology of Plato that you can buy Anaxagoras's book cheaply in the marketplace, he presumably isn't trying to insult his audience and tell them you could if you were literate, but that you could if you were interested, is his conception there. So I think many people could be reading it, but who are they in particular? Now, elite, what is the elite? And here's where Chris' book seems to me to be a bit undefined. Who are these people? Are they absolutely everyone who were what? Potentially supporters of revolutions such as let's say the 411 revolution or the 430 revolution, or the 403 revolution? Were they all, is anyone of that sort, anyone that we would call rich and conservative? Or were they the wealthy? Were they those with aristocratic leanings? How are we going to narrow them down? And here's where I think, yes, there is an elite, but it's an elite that is formed as the ideal readership of Xenophon's text, if I may put it that way. That is to say, most texts construct their readership. And a readership is being constructed here of highly talented people, of whom the rich rarely are, because they're absolutely convinced that they know everything because they're so powerful, and we understand that, and people very, very quick to learn. So it is an elite. Yes, it's a special group, but it's a very curious kind of special group. And I think Xenophon wants to appeal to them. If you ask me why, and if he thinks he has any larger political purpose, such as, for example, inducing them all to enter into politics, I'm just not sure. I really admire Matthew Christ's book, and yet I have some question in my own mind about, well, how much of a pragmatic political position this would have been, especially coming from someone who had not been in Athens for years and years, and he certainly has contacts there, and I'm sure that Athenian readers are among those he wants to read this book, but I don't know that I still would like to see that readership better defined. And that is what impedes me from answering your question adequately. But that I consider my own argument here as footnotes to yours, that much I want to say explicitly.
All right. We're in a situation now where this happened before, where we're a group of good people, and all 50 of you are being polite and holding yourselves back so that other people can have a chance to ask a question. So I encourage you to not be shy, but to put your hand up. And in the meantime, I'll ask a question, come make a comment. You brought together the Theodicy passages with Book 10 of the Laws. And what immediately comes to my mind is these are both, shall I say, stoicizing passages. I've forgotten the name of the monumental German scholar from around 1900 who argued vigorously that the Theodicy and the Memorabilia is a Stoic interpolation and not Xenophon's text at all. But that view has been held by a very learned scholar. And I've always thought that the portions of I love those parts of the Book 10 that you described and quoted from, in part because they're a basis for saying that Stoic ethics and theology represents an accurate, correct evolution of Platonic ethics. And so I just wanted to throw open the question of Stoicism in this mix between these passages.
That's going to be a harder one for me to answer, but it seems to me that the writer who conceived of a demiurge wouldn't be too far removed from one who thought of a figure who organized cosmane, the cosmos. He isn't here presented in his creator aspect, although he has some of that too in the laws, but he's presented rather in his managing. He has epimeleia, he has concern, the same word that turns up in Xenophon, concern for others, and he orders things in such a way as to be beneficial. That, if we see that in the laws, unless we want to assume that Plato developed this view, then had a copy of the Memorabilia to hand and said, I think I'll just insert a chapter with this more or less in a Xenophontian style and fool everybody hereafter that it was really Xenophon. I think that's unlikely. I think what really is the likelihood is that these two texts together testify to the fact that Socrates held and manifested some such view. Now, both Xenophon and Plato, for all I know, may have got this from a second hand. Who knows what the sources in between are? When it comes to Plato, we either ascribe it to an accurate memory or an invention on his part, because we assume he didn't have to depend on intermediate sources. Whereas with Xenophon, since at least we know in the case of the Apology, he did depend on an intermediate source, on Hermogenes, then it seems like in this particular debate, he might have done so as well. I don't have a firm view on it. I'm inclined to think, well, just for economy's sake, that both writers have reminiscences here of Socrates, which Plato surely elaborates in particular ways. And for all I know, Xenophon may have too, but there's a core similarity among them. And what's odd is that it hasn't been pointed out, because it seems to me rather conspicuous. When Sedley says that this argument precisely in Xenophon had no impact on Plato, but did, just for a small minor point about animals being subordinate to human beings on Aristotle, I think he just overlooked a passage that he surely knew and or didn't think that there could be such an analogy. And I don't think it's been pointed out elsewhere. At least I haven't come across statements of the connection. So that's my reply.
Thank you. Christopher Moore.
Hi, David. So I want to talk about 4.3. So I mean, and I have a couple things I'd just like to get your view on. One, about the provenance of the story. I mean, it's quite similar to an account that Theseus gives in the Suppliants, and there's also part of a story quite like this in the birds, in the cosmogony. So in any event, so I think since Tyler, since a century ago, there's been interesting connections there. So at least one can say that this is an argument form from, I can't remember, the Suppliants are from the 20s or something like that, or the teens. So there's that, but that's beside the point, sort of, except that there is this interesting fact that you mention, but don't draw much on, which is the important similarities between 1.4 and 4.3. But that aside, again, sort of, I mean, what is striking to me about this passage, among these other facts, is that I mean, it almost feels to me as though Xenophon wrote this. He's like quite taken by this, rational theology or whatever it happens to be, creationism or something, and he has to find a place for it, and he sticks it here in 4.3, where putatively the discussion is about sophrosune as a condition for people going into politics, where the problems are people like Critias and Alcibiades, is discussed in 1.2. And in those cases, it doesn't strike me that their failure of sophrosune is connected to their not doing religious ritual in the right way. However, it seems to me that the conclusion of the 4.3 argument is, dear Euthydemus, given all this stuff that we see in the world, we know that there's gods. What's the practical consequence? We need to show our appreciation of the benefactions. How do we do that? By engaging in ritual practice in the right way. So given the structure of that argument, I see how it answers the question, is Socrates engaged in conventional religious ritual practice? And why? presumably Euthydemus is not. I mean, I think that's why Socrates is giving him this argument. He seems like maybe he's lax. And Socrates, rather than just saying like, giving utilitarian reasons, well, you're less likely to incur animosity by others if you are irreligious. Here's a kind of cool, sophisticated reason, perhaps of the kind you would already find in the logoi of Sophiston and Poeton in your collection of texts. I mean, whatever the account there happens to be. But still, I guess what I'm curious about, given the sort of structure of your argument, whether you think there's anything strange about, as it seems to me, Xenophon's shoehorning, as it were, a set piece into an argument where it doesn't strike me as it fits exactly. Now, it fits in the way that he might be responding, or Xenophon is responding on his behalf, for accusations that he was not sophronein peritheon, theos. So here's an argument that he is sophron with respect to the gods. But, as part of the political education that's to be described in book 4, it's quite weird. So anyway, that's.
I think my answer here is going to depend in part, and I don't want to forget your earlier initial comment, but in part on looking outside just the memorabilia. And in particular, let's say the Cyropedia, which is a very good example. Cyrus is the most pious man going. He takes no action without consulting the gods. Is emphasized again and again and again. The same is true of Agesilaus, a little bit less thoroughly, but very much so. I think piety was central to Xenophon's conception of what the right life was. It's in his own self-description of his estate, and where he builds the shrine to Artemis, in which is core in his own way. I mean, he's not trying to represent himself as an Iscomachus, as a gentleman farmer. He's trying to represent himself as a pious person, and I think means to be seen that way. So for Xenophon, the answer to the destructive part of the Elenchus isn't, I'm going to give you finally a knowledge of what justice is. It is, I'm going to appeal to very different kinds of laws, which are hard to figure out. There are a few general points we could make about them, but we need piety. It's a little bit like juveniles. What do you ask the gods for? A sound mind and a sound body. That's about all. Everything else you ask of them, you're likely to be misled. It's likely to be turned as much to your harm as to your good. So this is the instruction. And it comes right down to a very peculiar, but well, not peculiar, very deep, but not easily explicable sense of what our relationship to the gods might be. Having answered briefly that way, I'd come back to your mention about the suppliants of Euripides and the birds. The birds passage, if I'm thinking of the right section, would almost seem to argue in the opposite way. The birds are going to show their superior virtue to the Olympian gods precisely by being helpful to human beings. By implication, the Olympian gods aren't. They're going to give some portion of their years to human beings. They're going to tell human beings where hidden treasures lie. They're going to tell human beings accurately what the seasons are so they can plant and not plant. In other words, worship us birds precisely because we aren't like the Olympian gods. We do care. So it's probably good evidence of sophistic concerns at the time with whether the gods are benevolent, and it may well be an indication. Now, the birds is 4:14, so well into Socrates' career, 9 years after the production of the Clouds. It is reasonable for me to think that issues about theodicy were in the air, but that you're giving the passage to Christopher. That this was in the case, but in just for that reason, that Socrates may have developed a very sophisticated and coherent description that impressed Xenophon and impressed Plato. and that may not be ascribable to others in the Socratic circle or among the sophists. And I'm reading your yeah, but that's the phrase. It's a relatively shorter bit. It's a reference in, and of course, that the gods support justice is already there in Hesiod, in the lessons that he gives to his brother. Just kings get rewarded. Just kings are the good kings, and so on. So I don't think that a connection, but one might go further and say it's very curious, the complicated way in which Xenophon does present the relationship between the gods and justice. The main thing I think to be noted is that Xenophon thinks this has to be proved. That Xenophon thinks this is something, Xenophon Socrates, let's say, thinks this is something you've got to be convinced of. This is something you have to know. And if you don't know it, then presumably in some sense you're not pious, you're impious. You're pious for the wrong reasons. You're pious in conventional ways. That's the kind of thing that, if not a reader of Xenophon, then somebody who had heard from someone else what Xenophon was arguing for in the Memorabilia might say, well, you know, this Socrates is just as dangerous as we thought.
All right. Well, I think it's time to thank our speaker for a marvelously rich and interesting paper, and hope to see you all again in September. But thank you, David.
Thank you all for being patient and listening, and I'll be happy to share my thoughts and paper with anybody who would like it. Bye-bye.